So you've probably heard people commenting, "Oh, those photos are so grainy. Oh, those photos are so noisy." This problem lies mainly in the camera setting known as ISO. So in this video, I will talk about ISO, the one of the three elements of the exposure triangle that you need to know to go in hand with aperture and shutter speed. And hey, in case you miss it, be sure to watch my previous videos on camera aperture and shutter speed, links in the description below. With that said, let's get into it. Hey, what's up everybody? Maximilian here from MW Photography. In this channel, we will explore how photography works with tips and tricks along the way to help you in your photography journey. So if you're new here, consider subscribing. ISO is a camera setting to determine how sensitive your camera sensor is to light in a particular setting. In your camera, the numbers will generally appear as 100, 200, 400, 500, 800, and so on. As used in field photography, the lower the number of the ISO, the less sensitive your camera is to light, and finer or less grainier the photo will turn out. A lower ISO will produce better photos with better dynamic range and capture more details in the highlights and shadows. While higher ISO number will do the opposite, where your camera sensor will have a higher sensitivity to light and therefore the more grainier your photo turn out. However, thanks to camera technology, the quality of images and high ISO settings are being improved, with every camera body announced producing finer photos at high ISO settings. Along with your camera aperture and shutter speed, ISO values also have exposure stops. An increase of one stop corresponds to a doubling of the light sensitivity. For example, an increase of one stop from an ISO of 100 is 200, and 2 stops is from 100 to 400 and so on. The opposite is the same in reducing stops in ISO. By increasing or reducing a stop in ISO, you will also need to balance it out by adjusting the camera aperture and shutter speed. In terms of ISO, there are a few questions which you have to ask yourself before setting your ISO settings. The lighting of the situation you're taking in. Do you prefer grain in your photos? Or do you prefer a wider depth of field or shallower depth of field? Are you or the subject you're taking moving or in motion? Are you hand-holding the camera or putting it on a stationary surface? In brightly lighted scenes, you will not need a high ISO as you can use the camera's aperture and shutter speed to allow the necessary amount of light to enter the lens. Whereas in dark scenes, you will need a higher ISO number to increase the camera sensor light sensitivity to increase the exposure of your final image. In case you're using an external light such as an external or inbuilt flash, you can also use a low ISO to capture the image since your external light source can compensate for the light loss. Now, noises appearing in your photos may not be necessarily bad, as it can be a nice complement to the image for some photographers out there, depending on the mood that he or she wants to express in their photos. The grains can also be added during post-production to add to the vintage theme of the photo. Grains usually wouldn't be as much of the issue if photos are uploaded on social media such as Instagram. If you prefer a shallow depth of field, meaning a blurrier background and foreground in your image, then setting a lower ISO will do the job, since the aperture will be wide open to allow more natural light to enter the lens. In case of sports activities or in capturing fast-moving subjects, you may need a higher ISO settings to compensate the light loss in the dark environment you're in, since you're most likely using a faster shutter speed to capture those photos. If you're hand-holding the camera and taking a photo in a darker surrounding, and however could not longer use the shutter speed and aperture to your desire, then it's likely that you will need to increase your ISO to compensate the light loss. But say if you're putting your camera on a tripod and planning to take long exposure photos, you can reduce your ISO number as minimal as possible, as you can compensate or increase the light entering the lens by adjusting the shutter speed and aperture, therefore obtaining a cleaner and brighter image. So in short, the higher the ISO, the higher the camera sensor light sensitivity, the grainier or noisier photos will be, losing some of the photo details, and faster shutter speeds and lower aperture adjustments will be required, and this is usually used in darker situations. While the lower the ISO, the lower the camera sensor light sensitivity, the cleaner and finer your image will be, and slower shutter speeds and larger aperture will be required, and this is usually used in brighter situations. Knowing the exposure triangle, which consists of aperture, shutter speed and ISO, is a very roots on starting your photography journey. So if you haven't done so, be sure to take some time to go through my aperture and shutter video series to understand the exposure triangle components as a whole. Links in the description down below. If you find this video helpful, do give it a like and hit that subscribe button for more future content such as this. Till then, take care and stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.